Hey there, welcome to True Crime Records. Tonight, we're stepping quietly into a case that shook Southern California during the early 1990s, a case built not on headlines or theatrics, but on silence, calculation, and a predator hiding in plain sight. William Suff didn't look like the kind of man detectives spend years hunting. He wasn't an outcast, a drifter, or a shadow behind city streets. He was a county employee, a man who delivered office supplies, attended workplace potlucks, and shared polite small talk with people who never suspected a thing. To the world, he seemed ordinary. To his co-workers, forgettable. And to his neighbors, harmless. But beneath that soft-spoken, unremarkable exterior, something else was living, a hunger for control, for secrecy, for power. While Riverside slept, women began to disappear. Fear moved through the city's night streets long before investigators knew they were searching for a serial killer. And all the while, William Suff blended into everyday life, unnoticed, undetected, unseen. Before we start, drop a comment and tell me which country you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always surreal watching this late-night true crime family stretch across time zones. Now settle in. Let the noise of the day fade away. And follow me into the quiet descent of a man who lived an ordinary life on the surface, and something far darker underneath. This is True Crime Records, and if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. There's a new story waiting for you every night. Chapter 1. The Childhood Silence. Early Signs of a Dark Path. William Lester Suff entered the world quietly, not in a dramatic storm of trauma or crisis, but in a kind of stillness that would follow him through much of his early life. Born in 1950 in a small Texas town, his childhood looked almost normal from the outside. A simple house, school days that blended together, evenings spent around television glow and family routines. But normalcy has layers, and beneath the surface of the Suff household, something colder was forming. William was not a loud child. He didn't throw tantrums, break rules loudly, or demand attention. Instead, he moved through rooms with the kind of quietness that adults compliment, yet rarely examine. Teachers described him as well-behaved, polite, soft-spoken. Rarely did anyone notice the blankness in his expressions or the way he studied people more than he interacted with them. He didn't seek connection, he observed it. In the neighborhood, other children played in groups, running across yards and trading jokes. William joined sometimes, but not quite. He was present physically, but distant mentally, participating but not connecting. When the others laughed, he mimicked the laugh rather than joining in. When they grew frustrated or upset, he watched with an unusual intensity, as if emotions were something he needed to understand from the outside rather than feel from within. Home life added another layer. His family wasn't violent in a highly visible way, but discipline was shaped by coldness rather than affection. Praise was rare, warmth nearly non-existent. Expectations were clear: stay quiet, stay out of trouble, don't ask for more than you're given. For a child who already struggled emotionally, it reinforced a message: emotions were weaknesses, relationships unreliable, attachment pointless. By the time William entered adolescence, he had already learned important lessons. Not the kind parents hope to teach, but the kind that mold detachment. Problems weren't discussed, pain wasn't acknowledged, and everything unpleasant was swept under silence. Somewhere in that silence, he began building an internal world entirely separate from the real one. He became skilled at hiding things, thoughts, impulses, curiosities. And the more he hid, the more powerful the hidden world became. Teachers noticed something shift around junior high, though most didn't know how to describe it. He was still well-behaved, still quiet, but the quiet felt heavier. Homework was completed with precision, yet the spark of curiosity was absent. Friendships were shallow, transactional, and brief. Some peers said he was odd, not in an alarming way, but in a hard-to-place way, the kind that people forget as soon as they turn away. It was around this time that his fascination with control began. While other boys boasted about parties, sports, and dating, William gravitated toward activities that put him in positions of dominance, not socially, but psychologically. He was drawn to animals, but not in the nurturing sense that marks empathy or affection. He liked animals because they were smaller, defenseless, unable to resist. The few incidents that raised suspicions never escalated to intervention. Adults brushed them aside as boys being boys. The world wasn't watching closely, and William learned an important truth. If he kept quiet and polite, he could do things without consequences. In high school, the detachment became more sophisticated. He learned how to blend in rather than simply avoid attention. He discovered that smiling, even if he didn't feel it, made people stop asking questions. He discovered that compliments, even if he didn't care, opened doors socially. He discovered that small talk, even if it bored him, prevented scrutiny. These were not expressions of personality. They were tactics, strategies, a system that allowed him to exist among others without ever being seen. The school counselor described him as neutral, not troubled, not thriving, simply there. But neutrality can be deceptive. Someone who never expresses need never receives support. And someone who never receives support never learns what empathy looks like in practice. Relationships remained nearly non-existent. He didn't date, and classmates didn't know whether he simply wasn't interested or didn't understand romantic connection. What no one understood at the time was that William's emotional world was already shaped around power rather than intimacy. The idea of closeness was foreign to him. It didn't hold meaning, only control did. Graduation came, and William stepped out of adolescence the same way he had lived through it, quietly. There were no awards, no celebrations, no memorable moments. He was not the kind of student teachers remembered years later. He drifted through the ceremony, shook hands, and walked into adulthood with the same blank composure he had carried since childhood. Outwardly, his early life looked uneventful. No major tragedies, no shocking trauma, no clear origin event that could explain what he would later become. But sometimes darkness is not born from chaos. Sometimes it grows from emptiness. A childhood lacking warmth can build someone just as dangerous as a childhood filled with violence. The absence of connection can shape someone who never learns empathy because they never learned its value. William Suff grew up not feeling overlooked, but feeling nothing. And as adulthood approached, one thing had become clear. His inner world was stronger than his outer one. The divide between who he was internally and who the world saw was widening. Every year widened it more. And soon, that divide would become a fracture. That fracture didn't happen suddenly. It widened slowly, quietly, as William moved into adulthood. Jobs came and went, not because he caused trouble, but because he left no impression. He would show up on time, complete tasks, avoid conflict, and then walk away without explanation when boredom or frustration overtook him. Supervisors described him as efficient but distant, the type of employee who performed well but never connected with coworkers or company culture. In every workplace he entered, he seemed to be present without belonging, visible without ever being known. His coworkers would later admit something striking. They couldn't remember what his voice sounded like. He spoke so little, and when he did, his tone lacked emotion, as if words had been reduced to a practical function rather than expression. Across these formative years, William learned something vital to the man he would become. Blending in wasn't just easy, it was protection. Nothing about him drew attention. He didn't spark curiosity, suspicion, or fear. He was the kind of person people mentally skip over, the kind of person who passes unnoticed through life. What no one realized was that this invisibility was not accidental, it was cultivated. William didn't want to be seen because being seen meant being analyzed, questioned, understood. And he wasn't interested in understanding or being understood. He was interested in control, the private satisfaction of knowing things others didn't, of feeling power in secrecy rather than recognition. Behind closed doors, William's inner world shifted again. The fantasies that began in adolescence deepened, taking on structure, narrative, and ritual. He increasingly imagined scenarios where he dictated every detail, where attention, obedience, and control belonged exclusively to him. These weren't dreams about success in the traditional sense. They weren't about wealth or admiration. They were about possession, the emotional and physical domination of others. But unlike some disturbed young adults who struggle visibly, William's fantasies didn't leak into his public life. He didn't rant, lash out, or isolate dramatically. His darkness lived behind a perfectly functioning social mask, and every year spent undetected made him more confident that he could hide anything. Relationships, romantic or otherwise, remained sparse, superficial, and short-lived. When he attempted intimacy, it wasn't intimacy at all. It was experimentation, a test of how far he could push, how much he could take, how little emotion he needed to display to maintain control. No one stayed. Some were uncomfortable, some frightened, some simply confused. But none reported him, none warned others, none believed he was dangerous. He wasn't the unpredictable, explosive type. He was something worse, predictable on the surface and unknowable beneath it. As the late 1970s arrived, something inside William crossed a threshold. The fantasies that once lived exclusively in his mind began to feel insufficient. The internal world he'd built demanded action, not for pleasure, but for validation. He wanted proof that he could control reality as completely as he controlled imagination. He wanted to make the outside world obey the rules of the world inside his thoughts. It was a psychological pivot point, the kind that rarely announces itself. There was no dramatic collapse, no breakdown visible to family or coworkers. The change existed only in him, as calm and quiet as everything else had always been. But now, the fantasy needed participation. It needed another person. And William began to choose his victims not with impulsivity, but with calculation. He chose people society did not protect, people who could vanish without headlines or coordinated investigations. This wasn't random. It was strategic. A predator grows stronger when the world doesn't even know it's hunting. And William had spent his entire life perfecting the art of going unnoticed. When he committed his first serious act of violence, there were no witnesses, no clear trail, no sudden eruption in his public life. Nothing in his behavior toward family, coworkers, or neighbors suggested anything had changed. And that was perhaps the most chilling part. He discovered that he could cross the boundary between fantasy and reality without consequence. He discovered that silence protected him. And he discovered that being forgettable was his greatest camouflage. The world around him continued undisturbed. The cities he lived in went about their routines. People passed him in grocery stores, nodded at him at work, waved to him in parking lots, never knowing that the man they were interacting with had stepped permanently onto a path of violence. Not because he was driven by rage or impulse, but because control had finally become more important than restraint. In his mind, the line had dissolved, and the world was now separated into two categories: those who noticed nothing, and those he could dominate entirely. By the time William entered the 1980s, his identity as a predator had already solidified internally, even if the world still saw him as an ordinary man. He had learned that society overlooks its most vulnerable, and he exploited that truth without hesitation. His behavior in public remained unchanged, polite, quiet, efficient. But inside, his fantasies were no longer fantasies. They were memories. They were proof that he could act without being stopped. No police reports connected anything. No witnesses described him to sketch artists. No investigators had his name on their desks. In the eyes of law enforcement, he didn't exist. And the longer he went unnoticed, the more brazen he became, not recklessly, but confidently. He didn't feel untouchable because he was smarter than everyone else. He felt untouchable because no one ever looked at him long enough to see him. In that dangerous equilibrium, total public invisibility and total private autonomy, William Suff entered the decade that would eventually make him infamous. The man the world believed they knew would soon become someone the world feared. But before fear, before suspicion, before headlines, there was simply a quiet man in Riverside County, waiting for nightfall. Chapter 2: The Fractured Man. Early Crimes and a System That Didn't Stop Him. William Suff's transition from silent fantasist to active predator did not happen in a dramatic explosion of violence. It unfolded slowly, under society's radar, layered beneath the routines of everyday life. The early 1980s found him moving from one town to another with the same quiet presence he had carried since childhood. But now, there was a new confidence behind his eyes. He had crossed a line and suffered no consequences. And once someone learns they can hurt others without being stopped, the threshold for morality collapses completely. He sought out women whose lives were already balancing on fragile edges. Individuals who, because of circumstance rather than character, were pushed to the margins. Sex workers became his focus not because of desire, but because he understood something chilling. When society ignores people, predators take notice. Women who lived transient lives, who distrusted law enforcement, who were targeted and discriminated against, they were his preferred victims not because they were weak, but because the system was weak in protecting them. And William always studied systems before people. His crimes during this period were not connected in any database. There were no television alerts, no urgent press conferences, no public warnings. Investigators in different jurisdictions saw isolated tragedies rather than patterns. Some cases remained unsolved entirely. Others were classified as unrelated assaults or disappearances. William learned to keep moving, not because he feared being caught, but because he understood how bureaucracy worked. If the scenes happened miles apart and months apart, no one would draw a line from one to the next. By day, he continued to work regular jobs. To co-workers, he was still quiet, still nice enough, still forgettable. He brought food to workplace gatherings, made small talk about nothing in particular, and maintained an appearance of normalcy that never cracked in public. No one saw the gradual precision forming in his violence. No one saw how he was establishing routine, patterns that made him feel in control, a schedule that separated his two lives so distinctly that even he may have begun to view them as separate identities altogether. The man who clocked in at work and the man who prowled the streets at night were two versions of the same person, divided by nothing more than time of day. During these years, William entered adulthood fully, got married, became a father, and stepped into domestic roles that made him appear even more stable. On paper, he seemed to be hitting all the milestones expected of a responsible man. There were dinners, errands, holidays, family gatherings. But even in those spaces, a divide persisted. He did not form emotional bonds, he performed them. Smiling in photographs, buying gifts, making decisions. These became calculated acts, rehearsed behaviors designed to maintain a facade. His family likely sensed distance, a lack of affection, a coldness they couldn't explain. But coldness doesn't look like danger until danger reveals itself. Behind closed doors, William continued to refine his predatory rituals. Violence became less about experimentation and more about identity, not a chaotic impulse, but a structured outlet. He sought total control of movement, of emotion, of submission. And when the moment ended, he walked away from his crimes as though switching off a light. He didn't panic, didn't rush, didn't spiral. He treated violence as something transactional, a private world that he could enter and exit at will. Some of his early crimes left survivors, women who escaped through instinct or luck. A few reported attacks to police, but the details they gave led nowhere. Their descriptions were vague, not by fault of their memory, but because William's face didn't stand out. He looked like every other middle-aged, working-class man. He looked like every other middle-aged, working-class man. He didn't speak much during the assaults, giving victims little to identify beyond generalities. Without clear evidence or multiple connected reports, those early clues faded into case files that would only make sense years later. His marriage eventually collapsed, not because the truth came out, but because his emotional emptiness became impossible to ignore. Divorces often reveal truths about a person, but in this case, the truth was absence rather than misconduct. William was distant, detached, uninvested. When the relationship ended, there was no dramatic argument, no declaration of resentment, only silence. For most, divorce is painful. For William, it was simply a logistical transition from one living arrangement to another. The separation barely touched him. That lack of emotional consequence was revealing, even if no one around him knew what they were seeing. After the divorce, he moved again, not because he was fleeing, but because starting over posed no difficulty for someone with no real attachments. In each new place, his pattern repeated with mechanical precision. Get a job, be quietly reliable, make no strong impression, observe people without truly knowing them. And at night, seek out women whose vulnerability came not from weakness, but from societal neglect. Investigators later reviewing his timeline would be stunned by how easily he slipped through the cracks. There were warning signs, but each existed in isolation. A neighbor who thought he was odd. A coworker who felt something was off but couldn't describe it. A family member who recalled his emotional distance. None of those observations, alone or together, came close to suggesting he was a serial predator. That is what made him so dangerous, the dissonance between how he lived publicly and who he was privately. The early 1980s would end without William facing accountability. He became more assured, more comfortable in his double life. The longer he remained undetected, the more convinced he became that he was smarter than everyone else, not because of intellect, but because invisibility disguised itself as safety. He had found a perfect equilibrium. The world ignored the people he targeted, and the world ignored him. That combination created a void where violence could thrive unnoticed. He carried that confidence with him as he approached the era that would define his infamy, not because his nature changed, but because his environment did. After years of drifting, he would eventually settle in Riverside County, California, a place where opportunity and risk intersected in a way that would shape the next chapter of his life and the lives of dozens of women. And in Riverside, the silence that protected him would continue for a while. But in Riverside, that silence grew louder because it was here that William Suff found an environment that concealed him more effectively than ever before. The city in the late 1980s was growing, changing, and overwhelmed. Population rising, crime rates shifting, hundreds of women living in transient conditions, many struggling with poverty, addiction, or homelessness. It was a community full of movement and vulnerability, and William recognized immediately what that meant for someone like him. The more chaotic a place is, the easier it is for a predator to hide. He arrived in Riverside as a nobody, and that anonymity allowed him to rebuild his public life from scratch with the precision of someone crafting a disguise. He got a job with the county. Ironically, a job that served the very justice system that would one day hunt him, delivering supplies to government buildings and sheriff's department offices. Every day, he walked past the people who would later investigate him, nodded politely at the detectives who would eventually learn his name, smiled at administrative workers who would inevitably testify about how quiet and harmless he seemed. And each time he entered those buildings, he gained another layer of confidence. The more ordinary his days looked, the less anyone suspected his nights. In those nights, the pattern that had been forming over the years sharpened. He drove the dark streets alone, searching not randomly but strategically, recognizing how society treated certain women as invisible and using that invisibility as his camouflage. His victims lived on the edges of Riverside life, people whose safety was rarely prioritized and whose disappearances rarely triggered urgency. When they went missing, some families didn't know who to call. Some feared reporting anything due to their relationship with police. Some simply assumed the missing would eventually come home. And William counted on that. Every time he acted without consequence, his conviction that he was untouchable strengthened. Over time, he began to follow local news, watching coverage of unidentified victims with a disturbing sense of satisfaction, not because he craved attention, but because anonymity confirmed his power. If his crimes were not connected, if detectives didn't know a serial killer was operating, then in his mind, he was smarter than the world around him. It wasn't the violence itself that fulfilled him, it was the domination of the system meant to prevent it. Meanwhile, nothing in his daily life gave outsiders a reason to question him. Coworkers remembered him as easy to work with, helpful, quiet but friendly. He brought homemade dishes to office parties, sometimes acting proud of his cooking, signs of humanity that made him seem even more harmless. When investigators later pieced together his timeline, the detail that would haunt many people was that he joked with police officers and deputies regularly, shared break-room conversations with them, and even delivered supplies to task forces trying to figure out who was killing women in Riverside. There is a certain horror not in what someone does, but in how close they can stand to accountability without fear. And William stood very close. During this time, the first investigative threads began to emerge, not through evidence, but through whispers among people who lived on the streets at night. Women cautioned each other to stay alert, to not get into strangers' cars, to trust their instinct. There was fear spreading among the vulnerable long before authorities began to understand what was happening. The women who lived closest to the threat recognized the pattern long before anyone with the power to stop it did. But because society did not prioritize the safety of those women, their warnings were not taken seriously. They didn't have press conferences, reporters, or political influence. Their voices carried only as far as the next person standing beside them. And William thrived in that blind spot. As the number of victims grew, Riverside police eventually began to suspect a serial predator, but by then, William had learned how to pace himself. He controlled the timing of his crimes, allowing months to pass in between, understanding instinctively that violence too consistent creates faster detection. He blended the escalation with the patience of someone who was not compelled by impulse, but driven by structure. This distinction later shaped his psychological profile. Not a man who acted uncontrollably, but a man who acted deliberately. When people describe monsters, they often imagine chaos. The reality is that the most dangerous predators are organized. While investigators worked tirelessly, William continued to participate in the community as though nothing had changed. He began volunteering for charity events, occasionally participating in public gatherings designed to support civic unity. Photos from the era, later examined by journalists, show him smiling among crowds, shaking hands, laughing mildly at workplace celebrations. His posture, his face, his charisma were painfully average. He looked like someone you wouldn't remember if you sat across from him at lunch. And that forgettability was the most effective camouflage any predator could ever hope for. By the early 1990s, law enforcement knew something was wrong, but the forensic technology of the time and the confusion of overlapping jurisdictions prevented clear answers. Investigators worked case after case without realizing they were all connected to the same man. And William? He watched. He paid attention to news coverage carefully, studying not the emotional elements, but the investigative mistakes. To him, every unsolved crime was confirmation that the world still didn't see him, that the system he worked inside every day could not stop the man walking its hallways. Like many serial predators, he was not supernaturally intelligent, but he understood apathy, stereotypes, and bureaucratic blind spots. He understood that the world is slow to protect people it already marginalizes, and he weaponized that understanding with patience and precision. For William, the escalation wasn't simply about violence. It was about invincibility. Every year he remained free taught him that his system worked. Every new crime felt like a reinforcement of power. Every day he walked past police officers without fear felt like victory. By now, Riverside was living in quiet danger, a threat without a face, a fear without a name. Investigators were trying. Victims were pleading. Warning signs were visible. But nothing pointed directly to the quiet county employee who seemed to live such an ordinary life. That illusion was about to break, but not by his choice. And when the break finally came, it would shock a city that had unknowingly been standing beside its predator for years. Chapter 3. The Divide Splits Open. Riverside Meets the Predator. The early 1990s brought a subtle tension to Riverside, the kind that doesn't appear suddenly, but settles in slowly, like a shadow creeping across a neighborhood that hasn't yet realized the sun is fading. Women continued disappearing, their lives folding abruptly into silence, and the city responded the way many cities do when patterns begin to form but cannot yet be proven, with unease. Patrols increased in certain areas, detectives compared notes, rumors spread among those who walked the streets at night. Still, the threat remained faceless. A killer was out there, but the question of who seemed unanswerable. William Suff watched all of it from the safest place a predator could ever stand, the inside. Every day, he drove a county vehicle across Riverside to deliver office supplies to government buildings, including law enforcement offices. He moved through hallways filled with detectives trying to identify the very man walking past them. He placed boxes on counters, nodded politely, and continued on his route. Most people didn't remember him even minutes after speaking with him. Not because he blended in socially, but because he blended in psychologically. He was the kind of man the human brain categorizes as unimportant. Not threatening, not impressive, just there. That invisibility created an imbalance. While the city fought to make sense of the killings, the man responsible was standing in places investigators assumed were safe. The irony was sharp. As police worried about the threat lurking outside, that threat was quietly dropping off office paper inside their walls. Meanwhile, the street-level fear intensified. Women who lived close to the margins, those who worked late, had unstable housing, or struggled with addiction, began to recognize a pattern long before the police officially announced one. They spoke to each other in hurried whispers, warning one another not to walk alone. Describing cars, recalling strange conversations, sharing instincts that society usually ignores. When danger targets vulnerable people, those vulnerable people learn to read the signs first. But warnings only traveled as far as the next person listening, because the system failed to take their voices seriously. The killer did not strike constantly, and that deeply confused investigators. Weeks would go by without a disappearance, then months. Then suddenly, there would be another. The timeline showed no rhythm, no obvious catalyst, nothing predictable. To an outside observer, the attacks looked sporadic. To William, they were controlled. Each silence between crimes wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. He wasn't trying to stop. He was trying to continue without being caught. The forensic limitations of the time made things even harder. DNA testing existed, but was slow, expensive, and used only in select cases. Fingerprint databases were incomplete. Communication between cities was unreliable. Detectives worked hundreds of possible leads that led nowhere. They interviewed witnesses who remembered only fragments. A car at night, a cold stare, a brief conversation that felt wrong. They assembled composite sketches that captured broad, universal faces, men who could have been anyone. Still, certain clues began to converge. Tire marks, fibers, locations, patterns in the type of victims targeted, the areas where bodies were found, and the methods used to control them. On maps pinned to corkboards inside police stations, detectives began linking pushpins by string. First 2, then 3, then more. Soon, walls and task force offices were filled, clusters of red marks forming around Riverside County like a constellation no one wanted to recognize. As the evidence slowly hinted at the presence of a serial killer, the community responded with a mix of fear and denial. Some people carried pepper spray or traveled in groups. Others convinced themselves nothing unusual was happening. People protect themselves emotionally by believing danger is distant, even when it isn't. Meanwhile, William learned something valuable. The more he acted normal publicly, the less likely anyone would suspect him privately. He doubled down on that strategy. He volunteered for charity events, participated in county initiatives, and once even supported a public fundraiser intended to help law enforcement. Every good deed added another layer of armor to his disguise. Co-workers described him as calm under pressure, dependable when needed, social enough not to be strange. There was nothing that stood out, and that was the problem. Investigators later would reflect on a chilling truth. The world expects killers to look dangerous. But the most devastating criminals survive by learning to look like the least remarkable people in the room. By 1991, the Riverside Task Force grew frustrated, motivated, and exhausted all at once. They were searching for a phantom, someone whose presence couldn't be proven but whose absence couldn't be denied. They conducted sweeps, interrogated men, analyzed maps, compared timelines. But without a name, without a license plate, without a face, they couldn't move forward. A city can be drowning in evidence and still have nothing if that evidence refuses to point toward a suspect. Still, something in the investigation changed during this period, not externally at first, but internally. Detectives began to suspect the killer might not be a stranger to the area, but someone living comfortably within it. Someone who blended in. Someone ordinary. It wasn't a complete theory yet, just a quiet instinct shared during late-night strategy meetings under fluorescent lights, where coffee cups filled and emptied and filled again. But the idea lingered. The killer may not be slipping around law enforcement. He might be standing beside it. Meanwhile, the deaths continued. The women who disappeared didn't just become statistics. They became reminders of how unequal safety can be depending on who society chooses to protect. Some families begged officers to treat cases urgently. Others grieved alone, believing the world didn't care enough to search. Funerals were small, often private, with only a few people in attendance. No headlines, no vigils, no outrage. That silence fueled William's sense of power more than any act of violence ever could. And then, for the first time, the investigation gained a thread. It was small, fragile, and incomplete, but it was the first thread that truly led somewhere. A vehicle spotted near multiple scenes. A partial witness report. An observation of a man whose presence felt wrong. It was not enough to make an arrest, but it was enough to start narrowing the search. William didn't know it yet, but for the first time, someone in Riverside was looking in his direction. The thread investigators found wasn't enough to identify a suspect, but it was enough to disturb William. Someone had described a man seen near one of the dump sites, and the description echoed him a little too closely. Tall, middle-aged, driving a light-colored pickup. The kind of vague detail that could apply to hundreds of men in Riverside, yet William knew it could also apply to him. For the first time, the game he'd been playing shifted ever so slightly. Not enough to stop him, but enough to remind him that he wasn't invisible forever. The unsettling part was that the investigation grew stronger without growing louder. There was no dramatic press conference, no citywide warning, no sudden panic. Instead, police began quietly tightening their approach, comparing notes more carefully, sharing information across departments, working late into the night. The task force refined the list of potential suspects, eliminating hundreds and then dozens, slowly closing the circle. The name Suff had not yet appeared, but the distance between him and the task force was beginning to shrink. William responded in a way that revealed the psychological machinery inside him. Rather than lying low or distancing himself from the investigation, he did the opposite. He became more outgoing, more helpful. He attended office gatherings, participated in small talk, initiated conversations with coworkers he normally ignored. Most killers struggle with the pressure of being hunted. William thrived on it. The attention the investigation generated, even if indirectly, fed a craving for control and superiority. Every time he heard others discussing the murders, knowing he was responsible, it reinforced his belief that he was smarter than everyone else. Hidden danger became a form of private entertainment. But the rhythm of control had its weaknesses. During conversations, he sometimes over-explained details or speculated too confidently about law enforcement strategies. Those who knew him casually never noticed. But one coworker later admitted that William's fascination with the crimes felt too invested, almost rehearsed. Social camouflage hides many things, but not flawlessly. As 1991 turned into 1992, Riverside faced a paradox. The killings slowed, yet the fear intensified. Crime rates remained high, but these particular murders, the most horrifying ones, seemed to pause. Some detectives believed this meant the killer had left the area. Others assumed he had been arrested on unrelated charges. A few feared the most chilling possibility of all, that he was simply preparing to strike again. They were right. William struggled more than usual to maintain control of his double life. His home life deteriorated. Financial stress increased. He felt the pressure of Clark County supervisors who wanted stronger performance and better work attendance. Even the smallest corrections triggered resentment. In his worldview, every disagreement was disrespect, every criticism a threat. He responded to these emotions not with communication, but with fantasy. Violent daydreams became his way of reclaiming the power he believed the world owed him. As that frustration built, the temporary pause in killings reached its breaking point. One night, similar to so many before it, William left his home without explanation. He did not wear a mask. He did not disguise his voice. He did not look around nervously. He walked into the dark with complete confidence, because decades of experience had taught him that the world wasn't watching him. Not really. This time, however, something changed. The victim fought harder. She screamed louder. There was evidence William could not retrieve. Yet he escaped before police arrived. It was not his most violent act, nor his most calculated, but it was the most important one, because for the first time, investigators gained physical proof that belonged unmistakably to the killer. Fibers, footprints, a clear description of the truck, and more importantly, a partial tag number. The task force, exhausted but unwavering, seized on the breakthrough. They spent long hours sorting registration records, cross-checking employee logs from state and county offices, running background searches through layers of bureaucratic paperwork. Hundreds of names were filtered, dozens removed. Then the list narrowed further. And for the first time, a name that had blended perfectly into the background began to take shape on a page. William Suff. But even at that moment, detectives remained cautious. They reviewed his employment history. They examined his previous criminal record. They learned about his old conviction, one buried by time, relocation, and new identity. They asked coworkers about him. Some described him as polite, others as odd. No one described him as threatening. The most haunting quote came from a colleague years later. "If you made a list of 200 people who could have been the killer, I would have put William at number 200. That was the turning point. Not the arrest, not the news coverage, not the confession that would someday follow. It was this moment, the shift from "we don't know who he is" to "we think we might." A fragile step, but a step nonetheless. As police quietly strengthened their case, unaware of how close they were to danger, William carried on as if nothing had changed. He went to work. He listened to the radio. He drove the same familiar roads. In his mind, he remained untouchable. Meanwhile, the city braced unknowingly for the storm about to hit. Because when a predator realizes the hunt is turning in the opposite direction, the most dangerous part of the story begins. The next chapter would not be about patterns, but about consequences. Chapter 4, The Task Force Tightens. A city begins to see the invisible. The name William Suff didn't trigger alarms at first. When detectives saw it among the short list of registered truck owners who matched the partial license plate, the description, and the general physical profile, it blended in quietly, just as William had always blended in among coworkers, neighbors, and government buildings. He didn't look like a killer on paper. His employment files labeled him reliable. His supervisor called him courteous. He showed up to work on time. He wore the county badge. He didn't have an arrest record in California. And that was exactly why detectives paused. Most serial killers, especially those who targeted vulnerable women, had some pattern of legal trouble, a history of outbursts, arrests, or substance use. But William had none of that recently. His background looked clean, almost forgettable. It was the absence of red flags that caught attention. People who work that hard to appear normal usually have a reason. Step by step, the task force began reconstructing William's life. Not dramatically, not urgently, but with the slow, careful focus of investigators who have finally found something solid. They looked at his work schedule and noticed that several murders occurred on nights that coincided with his deliveries. Nothing conclusive, but enough to stay focused. They pulled financial documents and discovered he had no savings and no unusual debt. That didn't help, but it didn't eliminate him either. They reached out to his neighbors and learned something subtle, easily overlooked. William wasn't social, but he wasn't reclusive either. He gave friendly nods, but had no close friends. He looked helpful, but never volunteered information about himself. He seemed approachable until someone tried to get too close. A polite wall stood around him, a boundary no one questioned because there was no reason to question it. One neighbor described him perfectly without realizing it. He was the kind of man you see but never remember. For most people, that is simply a personality type. For a serial killer, it is a weapon. As investigators continued, they ran William's background through deeper systems. And finally, something appeared that California databases didn't show. An out-of-state conviction. A crime from the past so old and geographically distant that it had been buried under name changes, relocations, and time. William Suff, the Polite County warehouse employee, had once been imprisoned in Texas for the violent death of his child. It wasn't enough to arrest him, but it was enough to watch him. Detectives planned surveillance carefully, balancing caution with urgency. They used unmarked cars. They followed him home from work. They mapped his driving patterns. William didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't show it. His daily routine remained predictable. He went to work. He did his job. He clocked out. He drove home. He ate alone. He spent long stretches of time in silence. Then something unexpected happened. One night, rather than going home after work, William drove slowly through downtown Riverside. He circled the same streets repeatedly, not because he was lost, but because he was looking. He scanned sidewalks, alleys, and bus stops. His expression didn't change. He didn't fidget or talk to himself. He simply observed. The task force watching him didn't yet know what they were witnessing, but they sensed intent. Then he drove on, leaving downtown behind and turning toward the outer stretches of the city, the streets where women walked alone, where addiction and poverty shaped routines, where police patrols were thinner and opportunities for predators were thicker. Surveillance officers radioed the task force. Detectives leaned closer to their monitors. The whole investigation shifted from paperwork to real time. Nothing happened that night. William returned home. But that wasn't the point. For the first time, police weren't following a crime. They were following a killer before he acted. In the days that followed, investigators dug deeper. They subpoenaed employment logs. They compared delivery routes to dump sites. They found fibers that matched carpet from the county vehicle. They found threads that matched blankets from William's house. Every piece alone meant nothing, but together, they built a structure strong enough to support probable cause. William still didn't panic. He maintained his routine. He behaved as if he were invisible, because invisibility had always protected him. Until one night, a patrol officer on routine duty noticed a familiar truck stop near a known street where women worked. He watched, waited, and called it in. The plate matched. The task force deployed quietly, unmarked cars moving like shadows around the block. William walked back to his truck with a woman beside him. When police lights flashed behind him, William froze for a fraction of a second, not in fear, but in calculation. He was deciding whether to run or talk, whether to attack or pretend. He chose the mask he knew best. He smiled. He acted confused. He apologized for parking improperly. He greeted officers like neighbors from work. The woman beside him walked away as officers focused on William, not realizing her life had likely been saved by mere timing. The officers found no weapons, no evidence, nothing illegal, but they saw something more important: his eyes. They flashed with irritation, then calm, then irritation again. A predator interrupted mid-ritual. It wasn't an arrest. It wasn't enough to stop him, but it was enough to confirm one thing with chilling clarity. Police had identified the right man. Now they needed to prove it. Surveillance shifted from observation to strategy. Detectives began preparing for the moment when William would make a mistake, because with predators like him, a mistake always comes. And it would come soon. The weeks that followed were a quiet chess match, police tightening their surveillance, and William operating as though nothing around him had changed. Detectives no longer waited for clues to arrive. They actively constructed them, pulling records from storage, interviewing former coworkers in Texas, speaking with people who once lived near him, and gathering fragments of a life defined by temporary jobs, sudden relocations, and relationships that ended without explanation. A picture began forming, not of a monster, but of a man who learned to imitate normalcy so well that no one ever questioned him. Investigators monitored every movement, paying attention not only to where he went, but also to the small emotional shifts in his behavior. They saw the tension in his jaw after criticism from a supervisor, the prolonged stares he directed at women who reminded him of previous victims, and the exaggerated cheerfulness that followed nights when surveillance teams believed he was preparing to hunt. A behavioral analyst was brought in and immediately recognized a pattern. William acted not randomly, but ritualistically. He sought control when something in his life triggered humiliation, stress, or frustration. Killings weren't spontaneous. They were emotional resets to restore power. Knowing this changed everything. Detectives stopped waiting for a crime. They started predicting one. They increased surveillance on weeks when William argued with management, or when his girlfriend threatened to leave, or when coworkers reported him acting unusually friendly. The task force prepared for the inevitable moment when his internal pressure demanded release. Then it came, abruptly and without warning. One evening after work, William got into his truck and drove with urgency that surveillance teams hadn't seen before. He hardly paused at stop signs. He scanned sidewalks with the practiced efficiency of someone searching for a particular type of woman. Police moved in silently, trailing him street by street, 2 blocks behind, then 1. William slowed near a stretch of road known for sex work, and when he stopped to speak to a woman through the passenger window, surveillance teams leaned forward in their seats, ready to intervene. But before anything could happen, a patrol vehicle approached from the opposite direction, not part of the task force. William noticed instantly. He told the woman something. She stepped back, and he drove away without picking her up. It was a small moment, but it said everything. He was looking for someone to overpower, but only under perfect conditions. Fear did not stop him, visibility did. That was the insight detectives needed. They realized they couldn't merely watch him. They needed to apply pressure. They wanted to shift his world just enough to disrupt his control, not to cause panic, but to provoke mistakes. Within days, they arranged for subtle disruptions. A supervisor questioned him about missing stock. A random, routine check of license plates occurred in his work parking lot. An anonymous complaint was filed about his driving, requiring him to speak to a manager. None of these incidents were dramatic, and none were illegal. But for William, they chipped away at the illusion that he was untouchable. His attitude shifted noticeably. The polite mask stayed in place, but something colder pulsed beneath the surface. He began driving with more aggression. He avoided eye contact more frequently. He stood silently at his desk longer before speaking. Surveillance teams watched him become internally unsteady, a predator circling his cage. Then came the night everything broke. William left work late, his face tight with frustration, his movements sharp and deliberate. He drove not toward home, but toward the outskirts of the industrial district, a location he had never attempted before. This wasn't his familiar hunting ground. This was new. That alone sent detectives into motion. They followed him cautiously, headlights dimmed, radios silent. William turned down a road with no streetlights, stopped his vehicle, and stepped out. He surveyed the area slowly, not for victims, but for threats. He sensed something invisible shifting around him, yet he couldn't identify it. When he got back into his truck and continued driving, he did so with an agitation that surveillance teams hadn't seen before. He was no longer confident. He was cornered, and that cornered feeling was what finally pushed him to act. Hours later, William stopped near another isolated location. This time he didn't hesitate. He spoke to a woman briefly, and she got into the passenger seat. The task force moved like a closing net, unmarked vehicles surrounding the area from all angles, but without activating lights or sirens. They waited for a moment when the arrest would hold legally, when William would make a move that made his intention undeniable. Minutes passed like hours. The truck sat still. Then investigators saw the shift. William reached under the seat. That was enough. The takedown command was issued. Undercover and uniformed officers surrounded the truck simultaneously, weapons drawn, but voices calm. William froze once more, eyes narrowed, expression unreadable, and then slowly raised his hands. He didn't fight. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand a lawyer. He just stared, first at the officers, then at the woman he nearly harmed, and then at no one at all. The control he had constructed for decades evaporated in a matter of seconds. Even then, none of the officers knew how deep the case would go, how many families would soon receive answers, or how many horrors remained buried beneath William's quiet exterior. They made the arrest because the law allowed it. They didn't yet know they had just ended one of California's most calculated serial killing sprees. Chapter 5. The Mask Breaks. Evidence Behind Closed Doors. The arrest of William Suff didn't feel like the end of the investigation. It felt like the beginning. Detectives knew serial killers rarely reveal themselves all at once. If anything, the moment handcuffs close is often when the layers finally start to peel. The morning after his arrest, investigators divided into teams. One team handled questioning. A second managed the county warehouse where William worked. A third prepared to search his home. The goal wasn't to provoke him. It was to reconstruct his world piece by piece, until there was no room left for lies. Questioning him began the way experienced investigators prefer, quietly, patiently, with no accusations. William remained calm, even pleasant. He denied everything without hesitation, but not with panic, rather with the controlled politeness of a man who had practiced staying forgettable for most of his life. His voice stayed steady, his expressions unchanged. If a stranger walked past the interview room, they might have assumed he was there about a parking violation rather than a serial investigation. But detectives weren't watching his face. They were listening for inconsistencies. Every time he repeated his alibi, there was just the slightest mismatch. A timeline off by 10 minutes. A detail swapped unintentionally. A comment too rehearsed. He didn't break, but tiny fractures formed. While interviewers worked strategically, the search team executed their warrant at his home. The detectives didn't rush. They walked slowly, methodically, trying to see what Williams saw, not what the public might imagine. The house didn't look like a villain's lair. It wasn't chaotic or cinematic. It was ordinary. A modest living room. Stacks of newspapers. Dishes drying in the sink. A television left on low volume, as though someone expected to return any minute. That was the pattern investigators had begun to understand. Nothing about William's outward world suggested the storm inside. But as the team continued deeper, something subtle began to change. Rooms looked more controlled than clean. Things were arranged with precision rather than comfort. Personal items were scarce. There were almost no photos. No mementos. Nothing that reflected emotional connection. The house didn't feel lived in. It felt maintained. Serial offenders often divide their environment. Public normalcy, private detachment, hidden control. Detectives sensed they were stepping into the third category. Then they found the first thread of evidence. A box hidden in a bedroom closet. Inside were small items with no logical connection to William. Jewelry, keys, trinkets, personal objects that didn't belong to him. Investigators didn't react outwardly, but inside the tension shifted. Trophies, not always valuable, not always intentional, but personal enough to connect victims to offenders, were one of the most reliable indicators in serial cases. And then the second team reporting from the warehouse radioed in. They found something too. A work vehicle closely matched fibers collected at multiple crime scenes. The same brand of rope the killer used was stored in surplus inventory under William's supervision. He had access, control, and opportunity, all in one location. Evidence wasn't proof yet, but the net was tightening. Back in the interrogation room, William began sensing the change in energy. He didn't show fear, but he became more selective with his words. He repeated the same sentences rather than constructing new ones. He tried to steer the conversation away from dates and locations and toward vague generalities. He wasn't crumbling, but he was concentrating. Predators who rely on control can feel when control is slipping. The task force didn't confront him with findings yet. Instead, they allowed silence to build around him. In psychological investigations, silence is a tool. Some suspects break under pressure. Others grow angry. William didn't do either. He simply withdrew emotionally, the mask becoming thinner, not louder. By late evening, forensic technicians finished cataloging more items, none individually enough to convict him, but collectively forming a puzzle that only pointed one direction. Detectives compared every discovery to the crime timelines, and the alignment grew tighter and tighter. Nights off work matched disappearances. Delivery routes overlapped with victim locations, and the personal items matched reports from missing persons cases. The most decisive moment wasn't dramatic. It happened when a forensic officer held up a piece of fabric under a lab light, a match to fibers taken from a victim's clothing. It wasn't theoretical anymore. It wasn't a hypothesis. It was a connection. The task force returned to the interview room with a new strategy. Not confrontation, not emotion, but quiet, unavoidable truth. They placed a single photo in front of William. Not of a victim, but of an object recovered from his home. Something that belonged to someone who was no longer alive. A detective asked only one question. Why was this in your house? William didn't answer immediately. He didn't ask why he was being questioned. He didn't claim ignorance. He just stared at the photo, not in shock, not in guilt, but in calculation. The moment stretched for nearly a minute. Then he leaned back, crossed his arms, and gave the closest thing he had to a confession without speaking. I want a lawyer. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was simply the point at which he realized the mask had broken, and the world finally saw him clearly. But the investigation wasn't over. It was only beginning. When William asked for a lawyer, the interview room fell into a quiet stillness, the kind that isn't hostile or emotional, but simply final. Detectives didn't show triumph or frustration. They simply collected their notes and stepped out, closing the door gently behind them. They weren't walking away from a confession. They were walking toward confirmation. From that moment forward, it was no longer about what William chose to say, but about what the evidence already knew. Back at the command center, the task force continued their work with renewed focus. Files covered the whiteboards, photographs were grouped by timeline, and a map of Riverside slowly filled with colored pins that formed a pattern no one could ignore. Search warrants expanded. Vehicles, storage lockers, discarded belongings, even places William had visited during work deliveries. What they found wasn't sensational or cinematic. It was quieter, but more telling. Items belonging to victims. Notes about locations. Traces of fibers and materials that matched evidence collected months earlier. None of it spoke loudly on its own, but together it formed a voice prosecutors could understand. Meanwhile, detectives didn't rush the public. There was no immediate press conference, no alarms to trigger panic. They needed a case that would hold in court, not one that collapsed under emotion or speculation. So they continued to build slowly, carefully, piece by piece, as the picture became clearer with every passing day. And across town, William sat in a cell in near silence. He didn't shout or bargain or cry. He asked few questions. He ate his meals. He slept through the night. Even behind bars, he wore the same cloak of ordinariness that had allowed him to move so freely through the world. But something had changed. Power no longer belonged to him. For someone who fed on control, the loss was more damaging than the confinement itself. His routines were set by others. His conversations filtered through lawyer. His silence no longer protected him. And as investigators continued uncovering evidence, William became smaller, not physically, but psychologically. His existence shrank from a life lived in the shadows of a city to a man contained within a handful of walls, a cell where time no longer moved according to his terms. Outside, the community began to feel a shift that hadn't yet reached the news. The late-night tension that once filled certain streets eased slightly. Patrol cars drove with a different kind of purpose. Caseworkers checked in on vulnerable women with more optimism than fear. Neighbors didn't know what detectives suspected, but they sensed something changing. The atmosphere of danger that had lingered for months was quietly giving way to something that felt like relief. It would take time for the world to learn why. Eventually, law enforcement held its press conference. The news broke softly but decisively. An arrest had been made, and the task force believed they had the man responsible for the string of murders haunting Riverside. Reporters filled the room with cameras, microphones, and rapid-fire questions about motives, timelines, and guilt. Police refused to rush to conclusions in public, but their confidence was unmistakable. They didn't express certainty through dramatic statements. They expressed it through steady composure. They weren't guessing. They weren't hoping. They were closing in on the truth. When news reached the families of victims, The reaction wasn't celebration. It was something quieter and more complicated. Relief mingled with grief. Answers came wrapped in heartbreak. Some cried softly. Some sat in silence. Some simply nodded, knowing that nothing could undo the past, but that injustice might finally have met resistance. Over weeks that followed, the case entered its final investigative phase, connecting every thread between William and the women whose lives had been taken. It was not fast, and it was not easy. Detectives worked nights, weekends, holidays, determined not to let even one victim go unidentified. Court documents began forming in thick stacks. Expert witnesses were contacted. Forensic specialists analyzed everything twice. Nothing was left to chance. And through it all, William waited. Expression unreadable, words limited to what his lawyers advised. The mask he spent a lifetime perfecting now less useful than ever before. The man who once believed he was unseen was now seen everywhere, in courtrooms, in headlines, in the eyes of a community that suddenly recognized him not as a neighbor or coworker, but as the figure who had stalked their streets under the cover of night. The story had shifted. This chapter wasn't about fear anymore. It was about accountability. And as the investigation became unshakable, the path toward trial and toward answers began to take shape. Chapter 6. The trial begins, a quiet courtroom, a loud truth. The courthouse in Riverside didn't feel like the center of one of California's most haunting serial cases. From the outside, it looked like any other public building, with people filing in and out, carrying case folders and coffee cups, stepping into routines that had nothing to do with the man seated calmly at the defense table. William Suff sat there looking more like an accountant than a defendant. He wore a simple shirt, his hair brushed, his posture straight, and his eyes focused not on the judge or jury, but somewhere far away, as though he'd slipped into the quiet interior world that had protected him for decades. The courtroom wasn't filled with anger or chaos. It was filled with something slower, a shared exhale from families who had waited too long for answers. Some held photos. Some held each other's hands. Others simply stared ahead, needing to witness the moment that had once felt out of reach. The prosecution didn't rely on theatrics. They relied on patience. They didn't portray William as a monster or a shadow in the night. They showed him as exactly what he was, a man who hid danger beneath ordinariness, who used forgettability as a shield, who relied on the fact that society rarely looks twice at someone quiet. Evidence appeared not as shocking revelations, but as steady steps across a bridge the jury could follow. Delivery schedules that lined up with disappearances. Material fibers that matched clothing and vehicle interiors. Personal items recovered from William's home that detectives linked carefully and respectfully to women who had been reported missing. None of it was delivered dramatically. It was simply presented with quiet certainty. The defense tried to build distance, suggesting assumptions, coincidence, misidentification, but with every passing witness, coincidence became statistically impossible. And through it all, William sat motionless, rarely reacting, listening without expression as strangers described the side of him he had spent years hiding. Some defendants break under pressure. Some become angry. Some cry. William did none of that. He simply listened. If the words affected him, he kept it sealed deep inside. That was the strange contradiction of him. On the outside, he looked like a man barely connected to the case. On the inside, only he knew. When the families of victims took the stand, the courtroom atmosphere softened rather than hardened. They didn't shout or demand vengeance. They spoke about daughters, sisters, mothers, women who had been loved deeply, women with stories and futures and laughter that should have continued. Their voices trembled, but they stayed steady long enough to honor the people they spoke of. Grief, when honest, doesn't need volume. It fills a room quietly. The jury listened without shifting, without glancing away, without losing focus. And even though the trial lasted for weeks, the emotional rhythm felt slow and suspended, like time had paused inside that courthouse until justice finished its work. Outside, the streets of Riverside carried on with daily life. People went to work, bought groceries, and lived their routines never knowing when the verdict would come. But inside the courthouse, time belonged to the case, and to the slow, steady unveiling of a man who once believed he couldn't be seen. As the prosecution prepared to rest its case, one thing became increasingly clear. William was no longer the man in control. The mask he used for decades, the politeness, the quietness, the unremarkable routine, no longer served him. The world wasn't overlooking him anymore. It was watching him closely, listening to every detail, understanding him in a way he never intended to be understood. And while his face didn't change, while his voice stayed silent, something deeper had shifted. The power he spent a lifetime gathering had left him completely. The courtroom wasn't just deciding guilt. It was reclaiming safety, dignity, truth. As the trial moved into its final stretch, the feeling inside the courtroom changed almost imperceptibly. Not dramatic, not explosive, but steady, like a tide shifting. The prosecution no longer focused on evidence alone. They focused on clarity. They weren't trying to shock the jury, because the jurors already understood the weight of the case. Instead, prosecutors walked them back through every connection, every timeline, every circumstance with the deliberate calm of people who wanted the truth to land gently but unmistakably. They spoke of William not as a monster, but as a man who learned how to hide inside ordinary life, who allowed his private impulses to exist in a space no one else could enter. Their tone wasn't angry. It was tired, the kind of tired that comes from months of long nights, from wanting to give families something solid to hold on to. The defense offered closing arguments too, framing the evidence as circumstantial and incomplete, raising questions about contamination, coincidence, and the possibility of wrongful interpretation. But their words didn't carry the same weight anymore. The contrast wasn't between good and evil. It was between clarity and doubt, and clarity stood taller. When the jury left the room to deliberate, the silence that followed was unlike the silence before. It wasn't heavy with suspense. It was filled with reflection. Families sat quietly. Lawyers leaned back in their chairs. Reporters waited with pens suspended above their notepads, knowing that whatever came next would define headlines, but also knowing that what mattered most wasn't the media coverage. It was the closure that had eluded so many for so long. Hours passed. People stepped out for air and returned. Coffee cups emptied. Sunset approached through high windows. And then, without announcement, movement rippled across the courtroom, subtle at first, growing gradually, until the bailiff stepped inside and spoke the words everyone had been waiting to hear. The jury has reached a verdict. No one gasped. No one whispered. Everyone simply rose to their feet and returned to their seats, preserving the kind of quiet respect that tragedies like this command. William was brought back to the courtroom. His expression didn't shift when the jury filed in. He sat the same way he had sat through the entire trial, shoulders square, eyes forward, hands folded in front of him. When the verdict was read, there was no sound from him. No sigh, no widening of the eyes, no physical reaction at all. It was as though the words passed through the air without touching him. But the reaction around him was very different. Some family members of victims let out a quiet breath, the kind that feels like waking from a nightmare. Some lowered their heads in their hands. Some wept softly, not in celebration, but in release. Justice doesn't erase pain, but it gives grief somewhere to rest. The judge thanked the jurors for their service and dismissed them with gratitude that felt sincere rather than ceremonial. When court adjourned, nobody rushed for the door. People lingered in their seats, absorbing the stillness. The first moment in a long time when uncertainty wasn't the companion in the room. William was escorted away without resistance. He didn't look back. The mask he had relied on for a lifetime no longer carried meaning here. Even without dramatic collapse, it was clear he understood one truth. He would never again walk freely through a world that once had no reason to look twice at him. Outside the courthouse, the world began to learn the outcome that had already echoed through the halls inside. Reporters delivered their broadcasts. Headlines rolled. Neighbors checked in on each other. Communities that had long lived under a quiet anxiety now allowed themselves to soften, slowly, cautiously, but undeniably. Closure doesn't come all at once. It arrives in small recognitions. A little more laughter returning to homes, a little less fear after dark, a little more peace in the routines of daily life. And that was the atmosphere that settled over Riverside in the weeks to follow. Not celebration, but relief. Not triumph, but the quiet truth that justice had finally reached the place it needed to. In jail, awaiting sentencing, William kept to himself. No interviews, no comments, no final declarations. The quiet that once protected him now simply surrounded him. The chapter that began in secrecy now continued in confinement, and the people who suffered because of him finally had space to breathe again. This was not the end of the story, but it was the end of his control over it. Chapter 7. Sentencing. The final quiet turning of the keys. Sentencing day arrived without spectacle, without the kind of media frenzy that follows high-profile cases in bigger cities. There were cameras outside, reporters waiting near the courthouse steps, but inside the courtroom, the tone remained the same as it had throughout the trial, controlled, calm, and marked by quiet, steady purpose. Families sat together again, some holding hands, some holding photographs, each of them carrying the weight of memories only they could understand. William was brought in with the same blank expression he had shown throughout the proceedings. He walked steadily, sat down, and looked forward, his eyes neither defiant nor fearful, just distant, as if this was another routine he was prepared to tolerate. The judge spoke with patience, acknowledging the magnitude of the crimes without raising his voice. He addressed the families first, honoring the lives that were taken and acknowledging the pain that had changed the landscape of so many homes. When he turned to William, he didn't speak with hostility. There was no need for anger. The facts had already spoken louder than emotion ever could. The sentence was delivered with clarity, a lifetime behind bars with no possibility of release. A sentence that mirrored what the community needed most: permanence. There was no applause, no outburst, no dramatic reaction. Just silence, the kind that comes from a room full of people absorbing a moment they waited years to reach. Some wiped tears, some stared forward, some folded their hands in their laps and exhaled slowly, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. William didn't flinch. He offered no final statement, no apology, no explanation. The man who once navigated life by blending into ordinary spaces now faced a future where routine wasn't a disguise, it was confinement. Court recessed, and people rose carefully, almost reverently. Victims' families filed out first, surrounded by advocates and loved ones. Reporters rushed toward the exits to prepare statements, but most who attended the sentencing moved quietly toward the doors, not wanting to speak into microphones, not wanting to summarize their grief for headlines. For them, justice wasn't a public moment. It was personal. It was the ability to sleep again without wondering if the danger still walked their streets. Outside the courthouse, a breeze rolled through the palm trees lining the walkway, and for the first time in years, the city felt lighter, not healed but no longer held hostage by uncertainty. Officers who worked the case shook hands not out of celebration, but out of respect. Respect for persistence, for teamwork, for the careful patience that built a case one detail at a time. In the weeks that followed, Riverside settled into a new rhythm. Street corners that once felt threatening during late hours became simply streets again. Patrol cars continued their rounds, but without the shadow of an unseen predator guiding their urgency. Women who had spent years adjusting their routines out of fear gradually returned to living without the constant instinct to look over their shoulders. And through it all, the name that once occupied so much space in the minds of investigators slowly faded into something smaller, not forgotten, but contained. Meanwhile, in a correctional transport van miles away, William sat restrained, staring out of a narrow window as the world passed in blurs of asphalt and sky. No one spoke during the ride. Correctional officers didn't taunt or threaten him. They simply performed their jobs. If William expected confrontation, none arrived. If he anticipated fear or curiosity from the officers, he didn't get that either. He was no longer someone to hide from or someone to fear. He was simply an inmate in transport, One more prisoner in a system built to hold men who once believed they were untouchable. When the van reached the state facility gates, the last sense of William's autonomy dissolved. The uniforms, the routines, the schedules, everything was predetermined now. The man who used control to shape every part of his private world now had no decisions left to make. It was the quietest kind of justice. Not dramatic, not sensational, but absolute. Inside the state prison, William's life did not unravel loudly. It faded quietly, one routine at a time. Intake processing stripped away whatever remained of his past identity. The clothes he arrived in, the familiar objects around his wrist or in his pockets, the sense of movement that once belonged to him. His nickname from coworkers, the warehouse badge, the community invisibility he relied on, none of it mattered here. In prison, everyone wore the same clothes, ate the same meals, stood in the same lines. The hierarchy was different, the social rules sharper, but the mask William spent years perfecting had no value anymore. For the first time in decades, blending in didn't make him safe, it made him ordinary. Guards registered him not as a threat, not as someone special, but simply as another life sentence inmate, another man assigned a number and a room. The first nights were the most revealing. William lay awake long after lights out, staring at the underside of the bunk above him, listening to the echoes of distant voices and metal doors while the facility settled into late-night stillness. He wasn't afraid. He just wasn't in control anymore. The carefully curated world he once built in his head, the one where he decided who lived and who was ignored, dissolved into a place where decisions were made for him every hour of the day. Over time, guards and inmates began to understand his personality, not through confession or conversation, but through silence. He didn't start fights, but he didn't make friends. He didn't boast about his crimes, but he didn't deny them either. He simply kept to himself, existing like a shadow in a space where shadows had no purpose. Meals were eaten in silence. Yard time became a loop of repetitive pacing. He found no attention and gave none. His world shrank from a city to a prison block, from a block to a cell, and from a cell to the interior landscape of his own mind, a place where no audience watched and no power existed. Meanwhile, beyond the prison gates, the case took on a softer tone in public memory. Victims were remembered not as headlines, but as human beings, their families honoring birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries in ways that kept love alive rather than trauma. Local organizations pushed for stronger protections for vulnerable women. Support groups began not because of fear, but because of solidarity. The legacy left behind wasn't the name of the killer. It was the strength of the people who survived the ripple effects of his actions. Detectives who worked the case moved on to other investigations. Some eventually retired, but the memory of this one stayed with them quietly, not because of the brutality, but because of the perseverance it took to bring truth to light. Justice, when it arrives slowly and patiently, stays with the people who pursue it. Years passed, and William remained behind bars as time continued eroding the edges of the story. New scandals and new cases filled the news cycle. The world shifted into different eras, different fears, different headlines. Technology changed, culture changed, even Riverside changed. Neighborhoods developed, street names evolved, the population grew. But one thing never changed, the sense that the city no longer lived in the shadow of something it couldn't see. Eventually, William aged into someone almost unrecognizable. The man who once moved through the world with carefully disguised confidence now blended into the prison population through frailty rather than disguise. He walked slower, spoke even less, and the few guards who remembered his arrival treated him with the same professional neutrality they gave every inmate. Time is indifferent by design. In the final stretch of his life, there were no letters requesting interviews, no media spectacles, no memoirs, no final message. He continued his sentence the same way he lived his life, quietly, detached, and unnoticed. When the day came that his life ended inside those same walls, it was recorded the way every inmate death is recorded, clinically, officially, without debate or emotion. There was no public vigil, No loud outcry, no final act that pulled him back into the center of the world. His passing didn't shake the community. It simply confirmed something that had already been true for years. The danger that once walked among them was gone forever. And beyond those prison walls, families continued to heal, slowly but meaningfully. The women whose lives were taken remained remembered not for how their lives ended, but for how they lived and loved. Their stories continued, not in courtrooms or case files, but in memories, photo albums, celebrations, and the quiet resilience that grows from loss. Riverside carried forward, not forgetting the past, but no longer ruled by it. Justice had taken time, but it had arrived in full, and it stayed. This chapter closed not with suspense, but with stillness, the peaceful kind that comes when danger has finally been confined, when truth has been named, and when a community learns, at last, how to breathe again. Chapter 8. The Victims Live On. A city that refused to forget. Riverside moved differently in the years that followed the trial, not with fear, but with a quiet determination to remember the women whose lives were taken. Their names were spoken at vigils, printed on memorial posters, and written into programs for awareness events. The city learned to shift the focus away from the man who caused the harm and toward the people who deserved to be remembered. Photos of the women began appearing at community centers and support organizations, smiling portraits beside candles and handwritten messages from family and friends. These memorials weren't displays of tragedy. They were reminders of lives lived fully, daughters, mothers, sisters, best friends, whose stories held more weight than the name of the man who hurt them. Every one of those women had been told for most of their lives that their fears, struggles, and vulnerabilities didn't matter. Society made them invisible. Riverside, finally, refused to do the same. As the city healed, grassroots groups formed to protect women working in high-risk environments, not through judgment, but through support. Food banks, safe ride programs, helplines, and low-cost housing initiatives emerged quietly, driven mostly by volunteers who had followed the case from the beginning. None of these efforts used the killer's name to promote their cause. Their mission came from the belief that safety is not earned through circumstance, it is deserved by everyone. Detectives who once worked long nights over case files returned to these events sometimes, not with speeches or authority, but simply to sit in the back and remember why they had fought so hard. They didn't see newspaper headlines, they saw faces. They remembered the nights they worked without sleep, the moments when it seemed like the answers would never come, and the weight of responsibility that stayed with them even after the trial was over. Some carried guilt over clues they wished they'd caught sooner. Others carried pride in the moment the case finally broke open. But every one of them came to understand that justice is never clean. It is built from mistakes, persistence, luck, and human lives that deserved better from the world. Meanwhile, the families left behind rebuilt their lives in ways that outsiders rarely saw. Healing didn't happen dramatically. It happened slowly, through birthdays where candles were lit beside photographs, through holidays where an empty chair reminded them of both loss and love, through moments where grief softened just enough to let warmth return. Some relatives found solace in activism, others in privacy. Some allowed themselves to speak publicly about their memories, others preferred silence. All of them handled the aftermath differently, but none of them owed the world explanations. Grief does not have a script. Riverside's younger generation eventually learned about the case not from fear, but from the programs designed to protect them. Teachers discussed safety, not monsters. Counselors taught warning signs, not headlines. Community groups focused on empowerment rather than panic. Over time, the story shifted from a tale of terror into a lesson about awareness, compassion, and vigilance. Not every city manages to do that, to take the worst thing that ever happened to them and turn it into a drive for empathy rather than paranoia. Riverside did. That transformation didn't erase the tragedy. It prevented it from defining the city. Years later, anniversaries of the arrest came and went with little public attention. There were no sensational news specials, no dramatic documentaries, no reporters camping outside doorsteps. The women were remembered on their birthdays, not on the day they were taken. Their families gathered on good days rather than the ones marked by trauma. Justice stopped being a headline and became a quiet, consistent fact of life. The story continued to echo, but differently now, as a protection rather than a warning. Young women who weren't even alive when the crimes occurred carried emergency contact cards and walked home with friends because their mothers and grandmothers taught them not to fear the world, but to move through it confidently and prepared. Male allies stood beside them, not above them, because the case showed that community safety requires everyone. In coffee shops, parks, libraries, grocery stores, places once filled with whispers, there was now only the hum of ordinary life. And that ordinary life was something the city had earned. The killer's existence faded further into irrelevance as the victims' names remained fixed in the city's heart. Everyone understood, even without saying it out loud. Memory can be an act of justice. Riverside's transformation didn't remove the scars. It turned them into lessons that protected others. The city no longer lived in the shadow of the past. It lived with the memory of those who shaped its response to the future. And in that quiet resilience, the women whose voices were stolen continued speaking. Through every safety policy, every awareness program, every moment when someone paid attention before danger struck. In the end, the most powerful legacy of the case was not fear, trauma, or violence. It was the community that rose to protect the people society once ignored. That was how Riverside healed. Not suddenly, not loudly, but completely. Chapter 9. The investigation that should have happened sooner. Long before the arrest, before the city realized what was happening in its streets, there were signs, scattered pieces of information that, alone, didn't look like evidence, but together painted a picture that should have turned heads sooner. Police departments across the region had received missing persons reports, many involving women whose lives were unstable or whose families didn't have enough influence to demand instant action. Sometimes reports were delayed because the women were transient, working late hours, or living without steady housing. Sometimes, concerns were filed but buried under stacks of unrelated cases, not from malice, but from understaffing and the sheer size of the county. In the early 1990s, law enforcement didn't have the interconnected technology they rely on today. Databases didn't talk to each other. Officers didn't share digital files. Suspicious arrests in one town rarely reached another unless someone made a personal call. Even when patterns began forming, women disappearing from similar locations, similar lifestyles, similar circumstances, the connections were faint, spread across neighborhoods and months rather than days. Detectives saw the dots, but didn't yet see the lines. Sometimes they were too close to notice. Sometimes the city didn't want to believe something darker could be happening in their own backyard. And underlying everything was a truth the culture didn't like confronting. When a killer targets people society overlooks, society often fails to see the danger. Years later, when investigators reflected on the case, one theme echoed through every interview: regret. Regret not just for what happened, but for how many opportunities were missed. There were moments when patrol officers interacted with William briefly during late-night calls that didn't feel serious at the time. There were chances when his work van drew attention but wasn't searched. There were neighbors who reported strange things but weren't heard loudly enough. None of these moments were large enough to trigger an alert on their own. But every missed chance became a part of the story. Detectives near the end of their careers wrestled with the idea that they could have stopped him sooner, that questions they didn't ask could have saved lives. It wasn't incompetence, it was a system that wasn't built to track the invisible, and William had relied on that invisibility for years. He didn't behave like the predator the public imagined. He didn't stalk in alleys or lure with dramatic threats. He lived quietly, drove a company van, wore a work badge, and clocked in like everyone else. When he was stopped by police for traffic reasons, he didn't panic. He behaved politely, and officers saw no reason to dig deeper. While the public searched for a monster hiding in darkness, the danger was standing in broad daylight the entire time. The first real shift came not from law enforcement, but from families. When enough voices told the same story, "My daughter wouldn't disappear without calling. She promised to come home. She always checked in. Detectives finally realized the disappearances were not coincidences. A task force formed quietly, piecing together timelines, phone records, witness statements, and evidence from vacant lots and rural roads. Patterns began to emerge, not instantly, but gradually enough that even skeptics started to see that the victims were connected. The breakthrough was not dramatic. It wasn't a single clue that cracked the case, but persistence. Detectives returned to earlier reports, walked routes the victims were last seen, interviewed motel owners, searched dumpsters, examined tire marks, and tracked down rumors that once seemed worthless. Late nights turned into early mornings, fueled not by sensational headlines, but by the faces on a bulletin board, reminders of why they couldn't stop. Detectives who led the task force later said it wasn't fear that drove them, it was stubbornness. They refused to let another life disappear without a fight. Eventually, the evidence led to one man. His name had surfaced before, not in a cloud of suspicion, but in brief, forgettable mentions. A co-worker who repeated a woman's name, a witness who recalled a van parked outside a motel, a patrol officer who recognized his description from another call. Investigators suddenly realized how close they had been, how many times the case brushed against the truth without grasping it. That realization made everything move faster. Surveillance teams formed. Undercover operations followed William's nightly routes. Vehicles matched tire tracks from crime scenes. A simple object in his home matched one taken from a victim. No single discovery clinched the case. It was the weight of all of them at once. When detectives finally secured the warrant, they weren't thinking about the arrest, the headlines, or the story that would follow. They were thinking about stopping the next tragedy. When the raid began, they didn't know what they would find, whether he was armed, whether he was home, whether victims were inside. Every officer on the scene moved with the tension of knowing the stakes. Inside the house, the discoveries varied. Some items were ordinary, some disturbing, some impossible to misunderstand. It was only after everything was cataloged, after every statement was taken, after every detail was added to the files that the full story of what had been happening in Riverside came into focus. The hardest question, in the end, wasn't how they caught him. It was how long he had been slipping just outside their reach. For detectives, that answer didn't bring comfort, but it brought clarity. The case taught law enforcement a difficult lesson. Justice isn't just about catching a criminal. It's about building systems that allow danger to be seen before it grows. Investigators carried that lesson forward. Police protocols changed. Communication across districts increased. Future cases were handled differently because of what was learned here. Some detectives retired soon after, exhausted by years of chasing silence. Others stayed in the field, determined not to miss the next warning signs. The arrest didn't erase the pain of the past, but it prevented the future from repeating it. And sometimes, that's what justice looks like, imperfect, delayed, but real. Chapter 10. The Arrest, when the quiet man couldn't run anymore. When the day of the arrest arrived, it didn't look dramatic from the outside. There were no shouted warnings echoing through the streets, no foot chase, no chaos. It began quietly, the way the entire case had unfolded for years, but with a shift so subtle that only the investigators felt it. Detectives had followed William long enough to understand his rhythm, his habits, the predictable loops of his routine. He left home at the same time each morning, returned around the same hours in the evening, and rarely deviated from the familiar patterns that made him appear ordinary. That consistency, once his shield, would be the very thing that allowed officers to intercept him. On the morning the warrant became active, unmarked vehicles moved into position around his neighborhood before sunrise. Their engines were kept off to avoid drawing attention. Officers sat in silence, watching front doors and windows through fogged windshields. Radio stayed low. Every breath felt measured. No one wanted to give anything away. William stepped outside just after 8 o'clock, coffee in hand, work bag slung over his shoulder, the same image neighbors had seen countless times before. He walked toward his van without concern, without suspicion, without any sign that he sensed what was coming. As he reached for the driver's door handle, officers approached from both sides. Not running, not shouting, just moving with. His breathing didn't quicken, his hands didn't shake. He simply straightened his posture and turned slowly to face the officers. "What's this about?" he asked in a voice so even, so polite, that anyone watching from a distance might have mistaken the moment for a simple conversation. But the lines had already tightened. Cuffs clicked around his wrists. He didn't fight. He didn't yell. The man who stayed invisible for years went willingly, not because he accepted guilt, but because denial remained his last tool. Neighbors watched from doorways and windows, stunned. Some recognized William instantly. Some rubbed their eyes, certain they were mistaken. The man who watered his lawn on Saturdays, the employee who brought holiday cookies to work, the quiet driver who always nodded at stop signs. That man was now standing beside a police cruiser in handcuffs. People whispered. Some stepped outside, others pulled back inside their homes. The quiet suburban atmosphere cracked for the first time. The officers placed William into the back seat of a cruiser, securing him with routine precision, then pulled away without sirens, without urgency, as if the silence was an acknowledgement of the weight of the moment. At the station, booking procedures unfolded with cold efficiency. Fingerprints, mug shots, searches, inventory, DNA swabs. Every step was documented, every detail recorded. William remained expressionless, answering questions when asked, but offering nothing extra. His voice was steady, his eyes calm, his tone nearly gentle. To the officers processing him, the lack of emotion was unsettling, not because it suggested guilt, but because it suggested nothing at all. When detectives entered the room to speak with him, the atmosphere shifted. They had imagined this conversation for months. They expected resistance, manipulation, bargaining, but William simply watched them with a mild curiosity, as if they were strangers asking for directions. They explained the charges. They outlined the evidence. They listed the names of the victims and the items recovered from the scenes. William didn't interrupt. He didn't protest. He didn't cry. He didn't confess. He only listened. His silence wasn't acceptance, it was control. As long as he didn't speak, he could pretend no one knew his truth. Behind the mirrored glass of the observation room, detectives stood shoulder to shoulder, analyzing every detail: posture, breath, eye contact. They weren't looking for theatrics. They were searching for the faintest flicker of humanity. None came. Hours passed. William continued to provide nothing. When detectives left him alone with a glass of water, he didn't drink it. He stared straight ahead, not at the room or the door, but at some private place inside his mind, a space only he could access, the same one he had carried for years. During the first night in custody, word of the arrest spread beyond Riverside. Local news stations began reporting the story. National outlets followed. Families whose daughters and sisters had disappeared received calls from law enforcement, asking questions that shook them to their core but gave them clarity they never thought they'd receive. For some, grief resurfaced with unbearable sharpness. For others, the arrest delivered something that allowed sleep for the first time in months. Not relief, but resolution. One of the detectives would later describe the shift this way. It was the moment the city finally exhaled. And yet, even after the arrest, investigators didn't celebrate. They returned to the evidence rooms, to the maps, to the lists of missing women. They didn't want to be wrong. They didn't want to assume the nightmare had ended until they could prove it. For weeks after the arrest, more interviews were conducted, witnesses were tracked down, and evidence was cataloged around the clock. Detectives walked through testimonies again and again, building a case so detailed that no courtroom in the country could find room for doubt. When investigators met families in person to tell them they believed their loved ones were connected to the case, some collapsed into tears. Some hugged the detectives. Some stared silently, shock freezing emotion in place. Closure doesn't always look like relief. Sometimes it looks like a new kind of grief, sharper but clearer, painful but honest. William sat in his cell through all of it, untouched by the outside chaos. He didn't ask for news. He didn't ask for updates. He didn't ask for anything. His silence continued even after charges were filed, even after the evidence mounted, even after the world finally knew his name. But the silence no longer protected him. The world had moved on without waiting for him to speak. His capture didn't erase what happened, but it stopped the story from continuing. That, in the end, was enough. Chapter 11. Inside the courtroom. The mask finally falls. The courtroom became the stage where the quiet man from Riverside could no longer hide in plain sight. It was not loud or theatrical, not the type of trial filled with disruptive outbursts or dramatic confessions. Instead, it unfolded with the same steady pressure that had carried the investigation, a patient, unshakable movement toward truth. Every day, William was escorted into the room, wearing county jail clothing, wrists cuffed, expression unchanged. He didn't scan the crowd, didn't look for support, didn't show interest in who had shown up to watch. The same calm, unreadable demeanor that allowed him to slip through life without scrutiny now hung around him like a fog that repelled emotion rather than concealed it. Some in the courtroom looked at him searching for signs of guilt, a flinch, a twitch, a tremble, anything that might suggest remorse or fear. Others watched him hoping to see the monster behind the crimes, something obvious, something that matched the brutality of what had happened. But William gave them nothing. He sat silently, hands folded, eyes forward, as if the trial had nothing to do with him. The prosecution began their case not with shock, not with theatrics, but with meticulous detail. One by one, investigators, forensic experts, witnesses, and family members took the stand. Diagrams, maps, phone records, tire impressions, fibers, fingerprints, trace elements. Every piece of evidence formed a line leading to William. It didn't try to impress. It simply existed, and the weight of it settled over the courtroom like a veil. Families of victims attended when they could, some every day, some only when they felt strong enough. Their presence was not loud, but it was powerful. They sat behind prosecutors, on benches marked by grief and determination. Some brought photos of the women they lost, holding them quietly in their laps, reminders that every fact mentioned, every exhibit presented, every sentence spoken was not abstract. It was human. Defense attorneys did what the law required of them. They cross-examined witnesses, challenged evidence procedure, questioned timelines. Their job wasn't to prove innocence. It was to test the case, to ensure the system operated fairly. But even their efforts felt fragile beside the weight of everything that had been gathered. The evidence did not rely on coincidence or speculation. It formed a pattern too precise, too consistent, too solid to question. When prosecutors introduced testimony about behavior, history, and the psychological patterns of serial offenders, it wasn't to sensationalize. It was to show how the crimes aligned with a mind shaped by lifelong detachment and a desire for control. Experts didn't describe William as impulsive or emotional. They described him as calculated, someone who did not lose control, but maintained it with alarming precision. Every sentence delivered by the prosecution was calm. Every exhibit was shown without embellishment. It was a legal presentation, not a theatrical one, and that was why it landed with such force. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy not with shock, but with recognition. People who once believed killers must look or act a certain way began to understand something more unsettling. The most dangerous predator is the one who looks like everyone else. Over days that blended together, more evidence was presented. Photographs taken before the scene was disturbed, objects cataloged from storage units, logs of phone calls, and vehicle movements. Detectives recounted the moment pieces finally aligned. Forensic specialists broke down the processes of identification in language the jury could understand. Jurors didn't look away. They didn't shift in their seats. There was no confusion, no conflict, no contradiction significant enough to distort what was in front of them. The truth sat in the center of the room, undeniable. When families spoke, the courtroom changed. Their voices trembled or remained steady, but every word cut through the silence. They didn't talk about trauma first. They talked about memories, birthday parties, inside jokes, favorite songs, dreams their loved ones once had. They spoke about the kind of laughter that could fill rooms and the kind of love that stays behind after someone is gone. Only after that did they describe the void, milestones missed, phone calls unanswered forever, the discomfort of holidays that no longer felt like celebrations. And through it all, William sat still, unmoved, eyes fixed ahead like someone watching strangers discuss a tragedy unrelated to him. That silence, that refusal to acknowledge anything or anyone, left a deeper impact than any outburst ever could have. Closing arguments approached not with anticipation, but with inevitability. Prosecutors summarized the case without raising their voices, without manipulating emotion. They didn't need to. The evidence had spoken for them. They simply reminded the jury of the lives lost, the patterns uncovered, and the work it took to bring the truth to light. The defense did what they could, pointing to gaps in memory from witnesses, possible alternative explanations, procedural criticisms. But even they understood the balance of the case. Their closing argument asked for fairness, not doubt. When the jury left the room to deliberate, the courtroom did not erupt into nervous chatter. People didn't stand or stretch or whisper eagerly. They stayed seated, surrounded by a silence that wrapped around every bench. It wasn't suspense. It was certainty waiting to be spoken aloud. Hours passed. People stepped out briefly for air and returned. No one wanted to leave when the verdict came. When the jury finally re-entered, no one adjusted their clothes or searched for dramatic expressions. They walked in calmly, papers in hand, with the gravity of people who understood the weight of what they were about to say. The courtroom rose. The verdict was read. Guilty on every count. There were no gasps, no shouts, no applause, just release, a long, collective exhale that felt like a city returning to full breath for the first time in years. William showed no visible reaction. Not anger, not sadness, not fear. The man who once lived in total control now sat in a world he could not command. The judge spoke directly to him during sentencing, voice steady, stating the lives lost and the impact on families and communities. The words didn't change William's expression, but they mattered to the room. They mattered to the families who needed to hear the system recognize what their loved ones endured. As the hearing concluded, officers guided William out of the courtroom and toward the life that awaited him behind razor wire and reinforced walls. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. His story in the outside world was over. The courtroom was quiet for several long seconds after he disappeared through the side door. And then, slowly, the room began to rise, row by row, not to leave, but to embrace. Families hugged. Detectives shook hands. Some wept quietly. Some smiled through tears. Justice didn't erase pain. But justice arrived, and that mattered. Chapter 12. Life Behind Bars. The Disappearance of a Personality. Prison did not transform William. It erased him slowly, reshaping the structure of his days until the world that once allowed him to disappear in plain sight vanished completely. From the moment he stepped into the state penitentiary, he no longer chose where he went, what he ate, what he wore, or even when he slept. Every hour became scheduled, monitored, recorded. In the outside world, he had relied on anonymity. Here, anonymity was impossible. The number on his uniform replaced his name, and even the smallest choices of daily life were no longer his to control. For a man whose crimes grew from a need for power and domination, the loss of control was a sentence heavier than the walls themselves. Prison life moved with quiet order. Doors opened, doors closed, meals arrived, yard time came and went. No one cared who he used to be. Nobody cared about his job in Riverside, the stories he once told, or the lies he used to slip between cracks in the world. Inmates didn't gather around him demanding details. They were too busy navigating their own hierarchies, alliances, and survival strategies. William didn't fit neatly into any group. He wasn't someone others feared, nor someone they wanted to follow. He had no reputation inside, no charisma to gain attention, and no desire to build one. He simply existed, a quiet presence in a place that forgot people quickly. His first years behind bars were marked by observation, not participation. Officers tracked his behavior, expecting either aggression or manipulation, but neither came. He followed rules, accepted routines, and moved through the days like a man who understood that resistance wouldn't give him anything. The silence he once used to avoid detection now became a form of self-preservation, invisible in a space where being noticed could be dangerous. Therapists evaluated him, though not for treatment. For the record, for the long-term assessment of someone whose crimes would later be studied by criminologists. He answered questions factually but without emotion, offering no insight and no remorse. His flat effect left professionals with pages of notes, but no clarity. Was he detached by nature? Or did he choose it as a shield? Psychologists disagreed, but in the end, their conclusions didn't matter. The law had already done what needed to be done. William spent most of his time in the library or in the yard. He didn't write letters. He didn't request visitors. He didn't reach out to the few relatives he had left. The outside world stopped being a concept. It became a memory he didn't need anymore. Prison didn't frighten him or punish him the way some expected. Instead, it reduced him, layer by layer, into a man without identity, without disguise, without audience. Months turned into years with the same rhythm. Breakfast trays passed through metal slots. Inmates lined up for medication. Names were called for visits he never received. Correctional staff changed over time. New officers who had never heard of his case walked past him without recognition. Slowly, the trial that once filled news headlines became a faded event. New crimes appeared, new suspects emerged, and his name slipped from public attention. The prison system absorbed him the way a deep river absorbs a stone, silently, completely, without ripple. He aged faster in confinement than he had outside. His hair thinned, his posture stooped, and the quiet confidence he once carried faded into something more tired, more hollow. Younger inmates came and went, some serving short sentences, others entering on life terms of their own. To them, William was simply another old man in a beige uniform, someone irrelevant to their world. Occasionally, investigators, journalists, or graduate students submitted requests to interview him, hoping to understand the psychology behind his crimes. He declined every request the same way, not angrily, but with indifference. It wasn't secrecy, it was detachment. Whatever he once gained from control or from the fantasy of power meant nothing here. Without the ability to shape his environment, he had no identity to perform. His crimes didn't make him important inside these walls. They made him forgotten. The prison chaplain visited his unit at times, offering conversations or prayers to anyone who wanted them. William never accepted or rejected the gesture. He simply didn't respond. There was no confession, no attempt to explain, no sudden turn toward faith or redemption. He lived in a quiet gray space between reflection and denial, neither acknowledging nor rejecting the past. And outside the prison, life continued without him. The city that once held its breath went on to build new neighborhoods, open new schools, light new holiday parades. Families who lost loved ones lived full lives of their own, not free of pain, but full of meaning. They honored birthdays and anniversaries, welcomed grandchildren, celebrated achievements, and learned to smile without guilt. Their healing was not because of William's imprisonment, but because of their own strength. Behind bars, William's world shrank further with each passing year. His cell became the only environment he could predict, and in that familiarity he settled into something like resignation. He didn't fight transfer requests, didn't request reconsideration of his sentence, didn't approach legal advocates. The justice system had closed around him, and he accepted it not as punishment, but as inevitability. One night, though he wouldn't have called it night, because artificial lights make time meaningless, he lay awake and listened to the usual distant sounds of the facility, doors clanging, guards walking the tier, radios calling codes. None of it bothered him anymore. It was simply the air he breathed. His decline was not dramatic. There was no sudden collapse, no medical alarm that sent officers rushing. It was gradual, joints stiffening, appetite fading, sleep overtaking more of the day. He was offered treatment, medication, support. He accepted what was given without resistance, not from gratitude, but from lack of concern. And eventually, the end arrived exactly the way he lived, quietly. When officers found him unresponsive one morning, the response was procedural. A medical team was called. Vital signs were checked. time of death recorded, paperwork completed. His belongings, few as they were cataloged and placed in a small cardboard box. There were no family members listed to receive them. No next of kin came forward. No one requested his remains. His burial was unceremonious and funded by the state, marked not by a name, but by a number, the last label assigned to a man who once tried to remain unseen. The news did not report his death widely. Reporters didn't crowd outside prison gates. Documentaries didn't break into programming. The community outside didn't stop what they were doing to take note. In Riverside, the day of his death felt like any other day, and that was the final measure of justice. His passing didn't heal the past. It didn't undo the pain. It didn't restore what was lost. But it confirmed something families and investigators had known for years. The danger was gone, permanently. And the lives of the women he took from the world continued to matter. In memories, in advocacy programs, in the way the city grew kinder and more protective. The killer died unnamed and unnoticed. The victims lived on. Chapter 13. The Psychology of Erasure. Understanding a life built on control. Long after the trial ended and the prison gates closed behind him, criminologists, psychologists, and behavioral analysts continued trying to understand what created someone like William, not to excuse him, not to sensationalize him, but to prevent the same pattern from happening again. His case was confounding because it lacked the theatrics and dramatic personality traits seen in many violent offenders. There were no rants, no manifestos, no wild confessions or declarations of hatred. The violence came from silence. The control came from stillness. And that quiet nature forced experts to look deeper, beyond the obvious labels. When specialists examined his childhood, no single traumatic event explained everything. Instead, there were hundreds of small fractures, emotional neglect, lack of affection, absence of validation, all compounded by a home where needs went unnoticed and feelings were dismissed. He didn't grow up in chaos. He grew up in emotional emptiness. That distinction confused people at first, but in psychological terms, it mattered. Many children who face turmoil develop coping mechanisms through connection, rebellion, expression, or self-advocacy. Children who grow up emotionally invisible learn something else. Control becomes the only guarantee of safety. For William, control meant staying unnoticed. The more silent he became, the more protected he felt. And as he moved through life, that belief hardened into something colder. A worldview where other people existed only as pieces in a private structure of dominance. Interviews with coworkers, neighbors, and acquaintances didn't describe a man who was angry or explosive. They described someone who blended in, someone who didn't evoke strong feelings one way or the other. He wasn't liked or disliked. He was simply present without being known. And to psychologists, that trait was striking. He never formed real relationships because genuine connection requires vulnerability. Vulnerability requires risk. Risk was unacceptable to someone who built his identity around maintaining invisible authority. When investigators mapped the timeline of his crimes, they didn't see chaotic escalation. They saw patterns, seasonal cycles of opportunity, routines disguised within daily life, periods of restraint following periods of stress. His behavior wasn't driven by impulse, but by planning and emotional drought. Violence became his twisted way of feeling something, not because he enjoyed pain, but because dominance offered the only sensation he understood as identity. The victims he chose weren't random. He targeted people the world failed to protect, not because they were weak, but because they were overlooked, the way he once felt overlooked. In his distorted psychology, that invisibility wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Being unseen gave him power once, so he inflicted invisibility on others, taking their lives and assuming no one would ask questions because the world hadn't asked about him. Control was the constant theme, over environment, over outcome, over the narrative. Even his silence, during arrest, during trial, during imprisonment, was a form of dominance in his mind. If he didn't speak, no one could fully decode him. If he didn't admit anything, no one could claim they understood him. To him, Silence meant possession of truth. But psychologists saw something else entirely. A person terrified of exposure, terrified of losing the illusion of power, terrified of being ordinary. Underneath his emotionless exterior was not superiority, but fear. A fear that started in childhood and metastasized over decades into something incomprehensible and lethal. Criminal profilers would later use his case as an example of the invisible offender, someone who hides not through disguise or intimidation, but through blending, routine, and normalcy. Not the monster in the dark, but the man who holds the elevator, carries grocery bags, and parks in the same spot every day. His case taught investigators that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it stands next to you in line and says nothing. Sometimes it smiles politely. Sometimes it disappears not because it is hiding, but because no one is looking. And perhaps the most unsettling lesson emerged after reviewing every interview, every recorded conversation, every scrap of documented behavior. There was no moment in William's life where empathy took hold. Not once. Not with family. Not with coworkers. Not with victims. He learned to mimic emotion when necessary. A smile, a nod, small talk. But these were performances, strategies for access rather than connection. That emotional vacancy is what made him so dangerous. Society often expects killers to present as volatile or visibly unstable. William was the opposite. He was the quiet man in the back of the room, unnoticed, unremarkable, and therefore unchallenged. When experts described him in psychological reports, one sentence appeared repeatedly: he did not feel connected to humanity. That sentence explained everything: the precision, the detachment, the lack of remorse, the lifelong need for control. But recognizing that truth did not resolve the deeper question that hung over the case. Was he born without empathy, or did the world teach him not to need it? Specialists still debate that point. Some believe he was predisposed to emotional coldness, and circumstances merely shaped the direction of his pathology. Others argue that the emotional starvation of his early life sculpted him into someone who believed feelings were liabilities. What no one disputed was the result. Control mattered more than connection, invisibility mattered more than identity, and dominance mattered more than life itself. Ultimately, his psychological profile revealed something that made detectives rethink their assumptions about violent offenders. Monsters don't always roar. Sometimes they whisper or say nothing at all. Sometimes they are born from rage. Sometimes they are born from emptiness. And sometimes the emptiest people are the hardest to see. In the end, the legacy of his psychological story is not a fascination with darkness, but a warning disguised as insight. The absence of empathy is not always loud, not always dramatic, not always obvious. It can sit quietly, unnoticed, until someone pays attention too late. And that is why his case continues to be studied, not because of the killer he became, but because of the silence he hid behind. Chapter 14. The Legacy of Fear. How a City Learned to See What It Once Overlooked. Long after William's death was recorded and the case formally closed, Riverside carried pieces of the story in ways that weren't defined by fear, but by awareness. The tragedy changed the city permanently, not through paranoia, but through vigilance. For decades before the case broke open, society had been conditioned to believe danger looked loud, chaotic, or obviously threatening. People expected criminals to behave like stereotypes: reckless, unstable, outwardly menacing. What Riverside learned instead was that danger can arrive wearing normal clothing, clocking into work on time, and nodding politely to neighbors. That realization reshaped the way the community understood safety. Women who had once been ignored or judged were now central to conversations about protection. Outreach programs replaced stigma. Support networks replaced silence. The city didn't blame victims anymore. It protected them. Advocacy groups emerged inside churches, community centers, and homeless shelters, not to warn people about monsters, but to make sure that vulnerable women were never invisible again. Instead of fear-based lectures, volunteers taught strategies for empowerment: how to check in with others, how to recognize patterns of risk, how to build networks of trust rather than isolation. The police department changed too. The case forced leadership to reflect on how blind spots and assumptions can cost lives. New policies required officers to treat missing persons reports with seriousness regardless of lifestyle. Databases began interacting across precincts. Detectives were trained to track behavioral patterns rather than rely on outdated stereotypes about offenders. Some of these practices eventually spread far beyond Riverside, influencing statewide and even national approaches to investigations. The names of the women who were taken became cornerstones of memorial scholarships, charity drives, and awareness walks. Their memories weren't tied to tragedy. They became symbols of perseverance, reminders that love outlasts harm. Every year, families gathered not in grief but in gratitude, celebrating the lives that were once overshadowed by headlines. These gatherings became rituals of healing rather than mourning. Survivors of loss spoke publicly only if they wished to. Many didn't, and their silence was respected. Healing wasn't measured in loudness. It was measured in how much space the community made for every kind of grief. For people who lived through the case, safety no longer meant locking doors or avoiding certain neighborhoods. It meant listening to instincts, checking on neighbors, and looking out for each other. The narrative shifted from fear to community. Younger generations grew up with greater awareness, not anxiety. They learned that safety isn't about identifying bad people, but about recognizing warning signs early and taking action without shame. The disappearance of someone vulnerable no longer resulted in shrugged shoulders or assumptions. It resulted in response. A culture of protection replaced a culture of dismissal. Riverside's evolution became an indirect memorial, not a statue, not a plaque, but a series of changes that meant future danger would never go unnoticed simply because someone seemed quiet or ordinary. The case also changed the way media handled crime. Early coverage of the investigation had inadvertently focused on the killer. Later coverage shifted dramatically, centering the victim's dreams, personalities, and families. Journalists learned, sometimes painfully, that the true story lies not in the person who inflicted harm, but in the lives impacted by it. Never again became more than a phrase. It became a structure. Not a promise made loudly, but a system built quietly. Better reporting procedures, community watch groups focused on safety rather than suspicion, shelters that offered resources without requirements, youth programs that taught empathy and assertiveness, and police units trained specifically to handle missing persons cases. Riverside learned that justice doesn't end in a courtroom. It extends into prevention. And the most meaningful prevention begins with compassion, seeing people fully, especially those society tends to ignore. Over time, the city didn't forget the case, but it stopped living inside it. New families moved in who never knew what happened. Their children played in parks, attended school, and grew up unaware that their hometown had once been haunted by a predator. For longtime residents, watching life return felt like the final stage of healing, not erasure, but renewal. One of the most striking parts of the legacy was how the victims were remembered rather than the man who hurt them. Their names remained in conversations long after his faded from memory. Their families carried forward their love in ways that didn't revolve around the trauma. They turned grief into action, heartbreak into advocacy, and memory into protection. Cities rarely get to rewrite their darkest history. Riverside did, not by denying what happened, but by learning from it. The case became a turning point about how society sees vulnerability, how it responds to danger, and how it defines justice. In the quiet evenings of Riverside's future, when streetlights flickered above suburban sidewalks, people didn't walk in fear. They walked with awareness, the kind that comes from a place of strength rather than panic. Generations who weren't alive during the case grew up safer because of those who lived through it. Every change in policy, every new shelter bed, every safety check-in, every awareness event formed an invisible shield around the community, a shield built not from fear of a killer, but from love for those who should have been protected. That was the legacy of this case. Not terror, not headlines, not a name in a courtroom, but resilience. The victims shaped the future, not the offender. And the city learned that healing doesn't mean pretending the past didn't happen. It means refusing to let it define who you become. Chapter 15. When the story ends. What we carry and what we leave behind. There comes a point in every true crime story when the facts have been recorded, the verdict delivered, and the perpetrator tucked away behind walls built specifically for people like them. And yet the story does not truly end there. The history of a crime doesn't finish when the killer dies or the case file is closed. It finishes when the community decides what comes next. For Riverside, the end of William's life did not mark the conclusion of the narrative, but the beginning of a new one, a quieter one built on recovery instead of fear. When word of his death eventually surfaced, it didn't provoke the reaction that dramatic endings often do. There were no crowds at the prison gates, no candlelit vigils for justice delayed or denied, no panels of experts on television analyzing his final moments. There was only silence, not because people forgot, but because the danger had already vanished long before his heart stopped beating. By the time he died, the city had already reclaimed itself. The families of the victims didn't gather for the news because they didn't need it to heal. Their healing had started years earlier, not at the trial, not when he was imprisoned, but on the days they chose to live again. Birthdays spent laughing through tears, milestones reached with empty seats but full hearts, quiet mornings where memories felt more comforting than sharp. In the end, the killer's final breath meant nothing to them. What mattered were the breaths they continued to take. His passing was simply a date on a report. The world didn't pause. The city didn't hold its breath. The calendar flipped to the next day. And yet, the case still had an echo, not a haunting one, but a reflective one. When criminologists looked back on the investigation, they didn't study William to glorify him. They studied him because understanding how someone like him went undetected for so long meant preventing others from doing the same. His silence and invisibility became data points used to refine psychological profiles, improve investigative coordination, and reshape training for young detectives. And so, strangely, the case, one built on human tragedy, went on to save lives. But the most powerful lessons weren't academic. They lived in everyday behavior. People checked in on each other more often. Neighbors took note when someone disappeared from their usual routines. The community paid attention to women who had been ignored for too long. Mothers taught their daughters not to second-guess their instincts. Friends refused to let each other walk home alone. Concern stopped being interpreted as paranoia and became a form of love. The case also broke a myth that danger wears a villain's face. Riverside learned that the most terrifying kind of predator isn't the one who stands out, but the one who doesn't. The one who blends. The one who understands how to slip between social expectations. And that realization made the city wiser, not afraid. It taught a new generation that safety isn't about fearing the shadows. It's about acknowledging that no one's life should ever go unnoticed. The most difficult part of the legacy belonged to the families. Some chose silence. Some chose activism. Some chose both, depending on the day. There is no right way to grieve. No correct timeline for healing. But every family found their own version of forward motion. They carried their loved ones not as symbols of tragedy, but as memories of joy. Jokes told around dinner tables, handwritten notes stored in drawers, stories repeated to children who would never meet the women they were named after. Their love traveled through generations, outliving the violence meant to erase it. And in that way, the killer failed more powerfully than the justice system could ever express. The women he tried to erase became immortal through remembrance. Over time, the case became something discussed only rarely, usually in history lessons about criminal psychology or law enforcement reform. Students would flip through old articles, occasionally shocked that such a story happened quietly inside ordinary neighborhoods. Teachers explained that the lesson was not fear, but awareness, empathy, the willingness to see the people society overlooks. When former detectives met one another in retirement, sometimes at grocery stores, sometimes at reunions, the case was mentioned only in passing, not because it had lost meaning, but because they had given enough of their lives to it. They had stayed awake through nights of obsession, anger, frustration, and breakthrough. Now, with time separating them from those years, they didn't need to talk about it to honor what it took out of them. They had already given everything justice required. And Riverside, the city they swore to protect, stood safer because of them. Decades later, the site of William's old home was nothing but an address with no memory attached. Children rode scooters along the sidewalk. Dogs barked from fenced yards. Porch lights flickered on during summer evenings while families gathered for dinner. Life, ordinary, precious, quiet life, returned completely. That was the true ending of the case. Not the arrest, not the conviction, not the death of the killer, but the restoration of peace. When stories like this are told far in the future, they won't belong to the killer. They will belong to the families, the investigators, the advocates, and the city that refused to surrender to fear. And when someone speaks the victims' names, in a memorial walk, or in a classroom discussion, or during a quiet moment at home, those names will carry voices, laughter, and memories. When someone mentions the killer, it will be with neutrality, not awe, not a myth, not a legend, just a man whose harm ended, whose power dissolved, whose story stopped mattering when he could no longer shape it. In the end, true crime isn't about the dark acts people commit. It is about the light that refuses to go out afterward. The city survived. The families healed. The women lived on in memory. The danger is gone. And the night is quiet again.